Killing aliens has been part of our culture for decades. It doesn't really matter where you look, television, film, or games, you'll find an endless amount of material on aliens and outer space. Hell, even some of the first games ever were about killing aliens. Why are there so many aliens in games? Well, space happens to be the perfect fictional backdrop for a game. Nobody really knows what's out there, so anything can be created. You can make a silly cartoon game, an epic space traveling RPG, or a survival horror game. And if you're going to be making a game in space, aliens are the perfect enemies you would want to drop into it. Dead Space 1 was one of the scariest games ever, and it utilized alien creatures called necromorphs to strike fear into the hearts of players. The game took place on a ship that choked you with claustrophobia, panic scares, and a foreboding tension with long moments of creeper silence. Ammunition was scarce, and you moved slowly through the doomed ship. Dead Space 2, on the other hand, has a lot more action, throwing you into a thrilling on-rails adventure that never puts on the brakes. The game was a lot more fast-paced, the fighting was constant, the aliens were everywhere, and popcorn set pieces created a movie-like energy that made the game feel so much different. Yet, the game still holds on to that horrifying tension with an incredibly thick atmosphere. The necromorphs are back, they're deadlier than ever, and Isaac must once again fight them in a diverse, terrifying space station to stay alive. Dead Space 2 lies at the halfway point between horror and action, and in that gray, it offers the best of both worlds. Old school horror and intense, vicious action gameplay, and a combination that just might be the best that's ever been done in this genre. In Dead Space 2, you play as Isaac Clarke, and the events follow the first game pretty closely. In Dead Space 1, Isaac travels to the Ishimura to investigate a distress signal and find out what happened to his girlfriend Nicole, who was on board the ship. Spoiler warning ahead for Dead Space 1. Through his hunting trek through the infested Ishimura, he discovers its inhabitants have been slaughtered and turned into alien necromorphs, and that Nicole has died. More importantly, he finds the red marker, the key to human immortality. His contact with it leaves him mad, and he barely escapes with his life. End of Dead Space 1 spoiler warning. Dead Space 2 takes place 3 years later on the Sprawl, a space station on the remains of Saturn's moon Titan. Isaac's goal is to reach the red marker and destroy it while being haunted by the ghost of Nicole. He'll also be discovering what the people of Titan Station plan to do with his knowledge of the red marker should he be captured. The game is broken up into 15 chapters, and you control Isaac in third person. You trek through each chapter in a linear format, killing necromorphs, meeting new companions, and advancing the story. On paper, this seems identical to the first game. However, in practice, the two games play further apart than you might think. The sprawl is enormous, and the gameplay areas have been opened up quite a bit. You can witness the huge scale of it from giant windows, dwarfing the quiet, eerie confines of the planet cracker. Design-wise, it's dark and beautiful and colorful, bloody and horrible. Every single chapter features a new part of the space station, and this gives the game a far more grand feeling. From a dimly lit church, to a school, to caves and mines, to tunnels, inner-city ruins, and zero-gravity space sections in outer space. There's a lot of environmental variety, each area having a particular color scheme as well, so the game feels fresh all the way to the end. Some small touches like neon tones and industrial shopping center vibes can remind you of BioShock's Rapture in a way. In contrast, the Ishimura was tiny in comparison, always cramped and confined. Mostly gray and brown too, its only real downside. It did choke you with its atmosphere and a vice grip though, and even though it was small, it was one of the most finely crafted game worlds you could ever ask for. There was no padding, no nonsense, and it was really scary. One of the first things you do when following up on a product is seeing what worked, what didn't, and how to get the product into the hands of more people. Remember, business isn't pro bono, so don't be naive to the inevitable. The teams working on Dead Space 2 did just that, and the data revealed that the number one reason people bought Dead Space 1 was because it was scary, and the number one reason people didn't buy Dead Space 1 was because it was scary. It's almost hard to grasp at first hearing it, but ultimately that meant that Dead Space 1 was only capturing the polar extremes of its potential audience. Though this shouldn't come as a surprise, as survival horror games are extremely stressful and taxing on the psyche. Not everyone loves being scared. The other goal when deciding on a plan for a new game is the idea of pushing the franchise forward, which means developing a new direction so that the two games don't blur into one. Some people resent game companies for innovating too much, as they want more of the same. You can't really blame them, but it's not hard to see how this attitude damages many brands. Ironically, people also get mad when companies release too similar a game. The argument here is a little bit more logical, but the problem remains. It's often a lose-lose situation no matter what the developer does. It's been well documented that Visceral Games had plenty of creative freedom when developing the first Dead Space game, but ultimately no one can stop the sands of time. Dead Space 2 was going to get an overhaul, and with some pushing from EA, it was going to take Dead Space from survival horror to survival action horror, and that comes with some trade-offs depending on what kind of player you are. In a nutshell, Dead Space 2 is a thrill ride. It's louder and it's easier to play, with fluid combat and an emphasis on live action spectacle. There's far less puzzles and tight corridors, and the game always keeps you moving forward. The map has been removed, as there is no need for it. You can't get lost, and just about every chapter ends with a bang. In Dead Space 1, chapters ended with a tram, and there weren't too many surprises or breaks in that mold. It was more about that eerie atmosphere, which the game did very well. This time around though, you never really know what's going to happen, where the chapter will lead, or what kind of set piece you'll be treated to. The unpredictable structure is great for the game in my opinion. All too often, it's easy to fall into a routine with a game, and kind of see what's coming next. This is traditionally exacerbated by front-loading, where games show all of their cards early in an effort to keep you engaged, and also to keep you from refunding the game. The first few hours of a game are always the most important for initial player retention too. Dead Space 2 counters this by keeping you guessing and ending all of its chapters with surprises, or action, or chaotic set pieces, or all three at the same time. But it never dishonors the hair-raising tension of the first game. It just tips the balance into more active gameplay and presentation. For me, I prefer Dead Space 2 because I'm really more of a gameplay kind of player, but I can understand those who find the Horde-style gameplay and the scripted Michael Bay moments sort of a black mark in the game. To each their own, I guess. What I love about the gameplay in Dead Space 2 is that it strikes the perfect chord between being immediately fun and accessible, but also involved and more intricate than you might think. Combat in Dead Space 1 was slow and clunky, as were the controls. The gameplay was also fairly basic and routine, thanks to a small weapon pool and a lack of complex game mechanics. But that's also what made it pretty awesome. Simple things done right, combined with a riveting atmosphere and a challenging resource system, made Dead Space 1 a cult classic in the style that it was made in. Strictly looking at play and mechanics, Dead Space 2 is arguably better in every way, except for that feeling that we've lost a little bit of that survival horror feel, which is fine because Dead Space 2 doesn't have to be Dead Space 1. Controls have been tightened up, Isaac moves around better, and aiming is more responsive. He must have gone on Jenny Craig in between the two games because his ass is certainly less fat. Inputs are snappier and ammunition is far more abundant. It's this that allows you to react to the more frenetic combat. These are gigantic changes to a genre that often has very tight and stiff controls. Sometimes controls are intentionally made stiff to make you feel grounded, but personally I love the fluid controls and I think they make the gameplay just far more enjoyable. I mean, this is a game that was made 11 years ago in which you have the responsiveness to stasis enemy barf in midair. It's pretty damn cool. These elements also make it easier to play in general, and starting from ground zero, this creates a more accessible entry point. Clunky controls make it hard for newcomers to overcome basic challenges. But a more overlooked fact is that better controls allow for more complex enemy design, since you'll be able to react a lot better to meet those demands. Mostly in Dead Space 2, this means being able to swivel to the side and behind you to catch enemies sneaking up on you. This was a lot more difficult in the original because Isaac almost turned in 90-degree angles. Dead Space 2 capitalizes on its light feats by designing more challenging and diverse encounters as well. Most levels have less corridors and more rooms, with plenty of space to move around, and because of this, lots of enemies are thrown at you, and in more varied combinations. This is something that was started with Dead Space 1, but because controls were so rudimentary, the game was never able to design anything too complicated, but Dead Space 2 blows it out of the water in both departments. To help you deal with the never-ending onslaughts, several game systems were changed or added, mainly stasis regeneration, limb launching, and weapons having ceiling mechanics that you can take advantage of. Ammo drop types were also changed, which I won't spend too much time on, but suffice it to say, Dead Space 1 had mostly predefined ammo drops, and in Dead Space 2, typically ammo drops for guns you're actively using. It's just a small thing I wanted to note, and something that makes it easier for all players to get in the groove of things. The idea of creating a low gate of entry for players has gained a lot of traction in the gaming industry for many years. Most of the time, all that's required of us is to simply point and shoot. The best games often have that low skill floor, but also a coinciding high skill ceiling. A skill ceiling is simply the amount of room there is to master the game mechanics. You can think of it as how deep the rabbit hole goes. A game with a low skill floor or high skill ceiling means that anyone can pick up the game, but a good player can keep getting better if they continue to master those mechanics. If you play fighting games, Guilty Gear Strive is a perfect example. As it relates to Dead Space 2, most weapons have that added margin for skill growth, as displayed by some of the game's sweeter mechanics. It's a lot of fun to stumble on these yourself, so I'll only talk about just a few of them. One of the new game mechanics is using limbs as bullets. If you shoot off an enemy limb that has a sharp point, such as an arm, you can pick it up and then fling it. Essentially, it acts as a free, piercing bullet. This system is fairly simple on the surface, however, it's important to note that not all limbs are created equal. Isaac must shoot off sharp limbs. It depends on the enemy, but legs, for example, are often blunt. Shooting legs off was the #1 best strategy in Dead Space 1 because it incapacitated necromorphs and allowed you to just kill them while they were pretty much helpless. The same is for Dead Space 2, however, it's often a better strategy to cut off arms, as those are the limbs that act as spears and thus do massive damage when you fling them. One interesting thing to note is that all body parts and objects do damage, even blunt objects, so it is possible to kill an enemy with a duffel bag, for example, if its health is low enough. Just something small I wanted to note. Anyway, you might be wondering why I mentioned this in the middle of talking about the highest skill roof of the game. Well, consider the plasma cutter for a second and how its alt-fire mode aligns with this system perfectly. Isaac can flip between vertical and horizontal fire modes for this gun, and the more dots lined up when fired, the higher the damage will be. The most popular fire mode of the plasma cutter is the horizontal mode, as it is more forgiving, and you'll typically hit 1 or 2 of the dots even if your aim is off a bit. This is especially true for dismembering arms, which are far more difficult to hit due to them being thinner than legs. So if we practice using the more challenging mode, it's possible for us to decrease the time to kill by half or more, which is great in itself. Now combine that with the limb shooting system, and I think you can see where I'm going with this. We now have a system where it is up to the player if they want to use the primary mode for guaranteed damage, or use the vertical mode to be able to one-shot enemies with a limb follow-up. Here's the optimal combo in action. So if we get good at using the alt-fire mode, we can save a ton of resources, and this is the game's way of silently encouraging you to be better at the game without saying it. This is what I mean when I talk about skill floors and ceilings. Anyone can shoot off a necromorph arm and throw it back at them, but the best players will use that alt-fire mode to do it in far less time and ammo. And of course, negating the risk by using the stasis to guarantee their shots will be lined up to ensure maximum damage is inflicted. This is why I really love the change to stasis in Dead Space 2. Regeneration was added to the stasis pack system, which means you'll pretty much always have a small amount of stasis to use for these types of situations. In the original, you either used a lot of stasis or you didn't want to bother because the pack system encouraged a lot of farming and some people just don't like to do that. There's a lot more example of cool game mechanics squeezed into Dead Space 2, and for the purposes of this video, I'll just focus on one more, and that's the Javelin. The Javelin is a new weapon that shoots out a deadly spear to which you can impale necromorphs, much like using body limbs. Because if you can get a necromorph to put his back to a wall, you can impale them for pretty much a one-shot kill. Its alt-fire mode has a pretty interesting mechanic with, again, another high skill ceiling. Hitting alt-fire creates a lightning storm around a javelin you've already discharged that damages nearby enemies. And after a short duration, it explodes, dealing massive damage. A lot of the Dead Space 2 weapons have nuances like this built into their kit, and the gimmick with a javelin is that the player can control when the detonation happens. And that occurs when the player releases their aim with L2. Isaac can cancel the storm at any time by doing this. Being able to time when the explosion happens allows us to optimize our damage by letting the storm last as long as possible. Of course, this isn't always possible, as enemies often flank you from the side or behind, which is where the skill ceiling comes in. You'll often have to decide the best moment to trigger the detonation, and that all depends on where you shoot the javelin. For example, you can shoot one at the floor to counter rush enemies or trigger the storm on already dead corpses that are in proximity of other monsters, and this allows you to take advantage of AoE damage and have more limbs to fling. The trick is really just to get that lightning storm to last its full duration, and the flexibility of the mechanic either way allows Isaac a lot more spatial control than was ever possible with Dead Space 1. Oh, and I almost forgot, you can also use the javelin to create your own door frame, in case, you want some privacy for a nap. The real winner of the combat, though, in Dead Space 2 is the increased variety of enemies. It just makes for such a more dynamic experience. Dead Space 2 has a ton of new enemies, and the designs are pretty terrifying. Just freakish, terrifying monstrosities and tentacly aliens of all shapes and sizes. You really gotta give it up for the artists at Visceral. They did a banger of a job. And most importantly, they all have a specific gameplay device to them, and because the game focuses on horde gameplay often, you'll often have to deal with multiple different enemies at once. This creates a lot more interactive mind sweeping on the fly as you scan what enemies to prioritize and how to react. And what's interesting is that the behaviors are often different depending on where they are in relation to Isaac. For example, Necros that usually run straight at you might actually sneak up on you if they are behind you. This is something special I only noticed on my third playthrough. But even without that advanced programming, every enemy needs to be dealt with differently since they all have different mechanics and each has a priority, which creates that mental scanning that I just mentioned. For example, you really need to shoot the alien babies and their orange death sacks. I recommend playing the game on hard difficulty, and if they get close to you, you're going to die. Rushers need to be frozen, the kids need to be grouped up to conserve ammo, and pukers are best dealt with by positioning yourself around hard cover. You always have to keep on the move, always watch behind you, and most importantly, you have to listen. The audio, once again, is the shining star of Dead Space, giving you all the information you need if you pay attention. The scenarios are hectic, fast, and deadly, but Isaac now has the resources and the sensitivity to deal with these encounters, which allows for the creation of its best enemies. Stalkers. Stalkers, stalkers, stalkers. If there was ever a best enemy in a survival horror game, it would be the Stalker. These things made me crap my pants. Stalkers are Dead Space 2's equivalent of the Velociraptor from Jurassic Park. They're smart, fast, and absolutely terrifying. They excel at flanking and swarming, and they'll often make sounds to fake you out. I'd be very surprised if there wasn't some form of communicative AI that allowed them to talk to each other in a sense and hash out a plan, because it seems like they're always on the same wavelength. They'll never all just rush at you. One is always hiding. They'll come at you from the back, they'll regroup. It's pretty impressive stuff, and AI like this is incredibly hard to program. With Dead Space 2's more varied environments, you get a huge diversity of scenarios to feature these monsters. From the church to the zero gravity section to the steam crate section, they're always a treat to fight. And Visceral does something very smart with these enemies. You only get to fight them 4 times in the entire game. All too often, games spoil the surprise by throwing far too many encounters at you, and this can make enemies lose their luster. It's true, Dead Space 2 probably has a little bit too much combat for some, and those would argue that it jeopardizes the feeling of that survival horror aspect. When there's a fight every 2 minutes, you no longer feel scared or tense. Things become routine, and the minutiae of the environments can take a dive because, well, nothing's special anymore. This is true to some extent. Dead Space 2 doesn't have the vibes of the first game, and that would have been a problem if the combat didn't get any love. But in Dead Space 2, it's faster, more fun, and it's extremely exciting. And the new enemies create far more creative encounters than the first game ever had. The weapons are insanely fun, and it never gets old. It's like being on one long, crazy action-filled ride to the end, and its short runtime would never make that a problem regardless. That's not to say the combat in Dead Space 1 is worse. Dead Space is an all-time masterpiece. It just makes for a different game, and I love both. Another interesting change to Dead Space 2 is how Isaac now has a voice. The silent versus voiced protagonist is an elemental game design choice, sort of like if you're going to choose if a game is in third person or first person, or if you want to have a male or female lead character. Either way, it's going to define your game. I normally prefer a voiced hero, but Dead Space was successful with Isaac because this game genre suits it more than others. Narratively speaking, Isaac was simply a vehicle for the story. He was just a terrified person doing whatever he had to stay alive. It really didn't matter too much what he would have thought or said. This obviously has some drawbacks like creating that player connection points, but maybe it's not so bad when you think about it. A mute character allows for the player to project their own thoughts into it, and with a relatively silent, creepy game space, you have a lot of room for players to wander in their own thoughts as if they were Isaac. Dead Space was unhinged, allowing you to get lost in your own fears and sort of become the writer. Toy with your emotions as you imagine what kind of person Isaac was. A game with a lot more sensory overload would make that more of a challenge, and honestly, it left a lot of possibilities open to who Isaac was. Was he really the hero, or was there a monster underneath the helmet? Mystery can leave a lot of questions unanswered, which doesn't have to be a bad thing. Adding a voice to Isaac and showing his face in Dead Space 2 somewhat ruins that isolated, unnerving feeling and the mystery of it all, but in reality it suits the story a little bit better than the first. Isaac's been around the block and he's fought the necromorphs before. He's way more decisive and he's confident this time around. He's never annoying and he never blurts out where to go or how to solve puzzles, just talking enough to relay his emotions so that the player can get invested in him, unlike in Dead Space 1 where Isaac was literally just a suit. A better frame of reference for who he is or how he's feeling certainly is a positive for character development too, which this game focuses on far more. This becomes apparent very quickly with his hallucinations with Nicole, which act as vehicles for how he's coping with it all. It may also say something that Dead Space 2 was made more thriller and less straight up horrifying in this regard too. It's hard to keep scaring Isaac when he's already used to it. In fact, he can be pretty funny at times, which would have been a little bit more out of place in the first game. And when you combine the frenetic pace of Dead Space 2 with all the action set pieces, the new characters, and its higher stakes, it may have been a little off-putting if he was simply mute again. As a quick tangent, I think they could have done a little bit more with Isaac's hallucinations. Dead Space 2 always uses the hallucinations in scripted, controlled environments, but what if Isaac had visions of Nicole while being attacked? What if he had visions of necromorphs while fighting other necromorphs, and he wasn't sure which ones were real or not? Everyone who's played the game knows how great the twist on visions is in Chapter 10, but why not take the concept and run with it a little bit further? If the idea was ever thrown around at some point, I'd have to guess it was cast aside for technical reasons. Dead Space 2 is a hard game to find a fault with. It never stays on one note for too long, and it always has something exciting up its sleeve. It plays like a slick, modern third-person shooter, with great diverse weapons, highly improved game mechanics, better enemies, and a story that keeps you glued to your screen until the finale. It allows you the freedom to play any way you want. Upgrading the starting weapon and sticking to it is a perfectly viable option. It makes encounters more interesting, while also providing more comfortable gameplay, making combat one of its greatest strengths, rather than one of its more clunky features. It might double down on the action, but the truth is, it still never forgets the horror. Titan Station is breathtaking and varied, and even if you don't like the set pieces, you have to admit, they move the story forward at the perfect pace, giving you a fair difficulty curve in the process, with generous save points and mostly non-BS enemy placements, while retaining the most brilliant audio design, dynamic lighting, and non-invasive HUD in any game that released for years to come. It is simply one of the most enjoyable 8 hours of gaming that you might ever find. When the worst thing about your game is that the cutscenes are unskippable, or how the weapon swap graphic blocks your screen for a second too long, you know you've made a masterpiece. Despite it all though, Dead Space 2 is still not a household game by any means, and it was declared a commercial failure by Electronic Arts. Exact sales counts have been long held hostage by publishers, but it was rumored that Dead Space 2 sold about 4 million units, with a $70 million budget and a lavish $60 million marketing campaign. Minus rights, licenses, fees to hardware companies, and cuts to retailers, it's likely that Dead Space 2 didn't even break even. To this day, it remains tucked away quietly in this industry's most underappreciated classics, talked about by those who loved it, but never appreciated for the masterpiece it is by the world. If you love anything about action games, survival games, horror, or games about killing aliens, you owe it to yourself to play it, even 11 years later. I cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye. You will love it.